The United States and Sudan have had diplomatic relations since 1956, but their relationship has been anything but harmonious. So it's worth asking, why does Washington care what happens in Sudan? First, the human rights situation. The Bush administration said that the Bashir government's treatment of the people in Darfur constituted genocide. The Obama administration hasn't changed its position. Even so, the Obama administration now says that it's quite worried that after next month's referendum in southern Sudan, the people in Khartoum may take out their anger on the people of Darfur. They say they don't want that to happen. Second, the promise of economic ties, or rather the reestablishment of them. In 1997 and again in 2007, Washington imposed economic sanctions on Khartoum because it accused the Sudanese government of supporting terrorist groups. As a result, Sudan has been unable to profit from the daily production of some 500,000 barrels of oil, as well as from the sale of cotton and sugar. It's also had to accept humanitarian aid from Washington and other countries because that country has suffered from drought periodically since the early 1990s. It's also heavily in debt to the International Monetary Fund. Washington has promised to renew full economic relations with Sudan if it promises to reform its economy and to make other changes in its government.
Qatar has been hosting talks aimed at bringing peace to Darfur for more than 2 years now. From the outset, it is said that Darfur is one of the most complicated issues in the 21st century. This hotel is the venue where most of these talks and negotiations are taking place. Hundreds of people are taking part, from Sudanese officials to rebel groups and non-governmental organizations. So what has the Qatari-led mediation managed to do so far? Well, it has brought most of the internal and external main players, that includes Sudanese government officials, Darfur rebels, and with solid backing from the international community represented by the United Nations, the European Union, the African Union and the Arab League. It managed to convince the government of Sudan and the Justice and Equality Movement, that's the biggest rebel group in Darfur, to sign a framework agreement and a temporary ceasefire that didn't last long. It also mediated an initial peace deal between the government of Sudan and the Justice and Liberation Movement, that's an umbrella group made of smaller Darfur rebel groups. But the final and the comprehensive peace deal with all groups remain elusive.
Sudan has been a major focus of the United Nations for the last 6 months. Many members are welcoming the upcoming referendum that could give South Sudan its independence. Now, the head of the UN peacekeeping forces, he met here in front of the Security Council. He expressed concern over the January 9th vote. The disputed Abyei region, oil-rich region between the north and the south, still remains unresolved, and there's a possibility that more peacekeeping forces might need to be sent in to maintain the peace during that referendum. So even if the referendum goes off smoothly, both the North and the South still face serious developmental challenges. After 4 decades of war that killed nearly 2 million people, Sudan is ravaged. In the North, outside of the capital Khartoum, there's very little development. In the South, when the peace accord was signed in 2005, there was just over 10 kilometers of paved tarmac. In the South, it has the oil resources, is also very fertile soil. So if it becomes a viable nation, it can provide stability for the region. So, if the referendum goes off and the possibility of a South Sudan flag flying here in front of the UN headquarters is a reality, both the North and the South can focus on development and building for a future.
Well, 2 new nations with oil, minerals, water and wealth throw up all sorts of questions for other countries. Let's look at some of those with Rakia Abu Sharaf. Before we get to those other countries, do you think people in Sudan want development?
Absolutely. Right now, development is key to the issue of grievances, the issues of this marginalization. It will be important in this time and day to try to create a sense of development that meets the basic needs of ordinary citizens.
But it's not really a case of them wanting big, shiny buildings and, filling it with tribesmen who are not used to that kind of thing.
People are trying to make ends meet, and development for them would mean an entirely different set of goals and values that they want to achieve.
If oil revenue is concentrated on development infrastructure in areas such as Darfur and South Sudan, do you think it could bring some sort of stability there?
Absolutely. because what is happening right now is the sense of marginalization is coming from the fact that people do compare and contrast and feel that they don't have access to what they rightly deserve.
How do you bring about this type of development when there's something like 30 million landmines dotted around the country?
That opens up a great debate about the importance of land. And right now, when we talk about resources and we concentrate so much on oil, we tend to forget about land and its significance. Right now, what happens is when we talk about mines, we also talk about limited space that is being available and open to people to voluntarily return or exploit if you are already there.
What sort of development do you think neighbouring countries will bring? We know that a highway has already been built between Kenya and Juba.
Markets in terms of contribution to markets, in terms of migration to South Sudan. We already came to learn a great deal about incoming migrations from Ethiopia, Uganda, and Kenya. All of them are trying to gain a footing in a new and unfolding state.
Because what's quite interesting is that economic growth over the last 10 years averaged at 7.1%. I mean, quite remarkable when you hear about how unstable the country's been. Despite that, it's had this unbelievable growth. So it's been getting some sort of investment in its development from somewhere, hasn't it?
Absolutely, and we need to acknowledge so that we can get to understanding of the causes and the consequences for the society at large, to acknowledge where people actually succeeded and where they fell short.
When you think of the poverty in the country and the lack of education, I mean, surely it's got to start with the basics now, with children being educated, making sure that women can learn to read and write.
When you leave women and children, we have to also understand that they have been the most affected by the consequences of war. They have been the majority of internally displaced people, and so the investment in long-term development, long-term sustainability lies ultimately with understanding their significant contributions to society. And of course, the question of youth is extremely important and relevant for the rebuilding of South Sudan and the Sudan in general.
Thanks, Rokia. Well, we've mentioned the extraordinary diversity of Sudan, which is the source of this split. Each tribe has its political structure and many have military wings. Sebastian Walker looks now at Sudan's armed groups.
With fears of fresh conflict growing in the Sudan, armed groups will have a crucial role to play. In southern Sudan, the ruling Sudan People's Liberation Movement and army is meant to control security. But the rebel government has had to quell uprisings by dissident groups following April's election, with former SPLA commander George Athor one of the key figures in those revolts. North of the border, the Sudan armed forces are supported by the paramilitary group known as the Popular Defense Forces. In Darfur, the main armed groups have splintered into more than 24 factions, with former members of the Justice and Equality Movement and Sudan Liberation Army involved in heavy fighting earlier this year. Groups like the Bija Congress are lying low in eastern Sudan, but a bigger threat is on the border between north and south. The three areas of Abyei, South Kordofan and Blue Nile contain forces from both north and south, as well as the Messaria tribe, which can marshal tens of thousands of fighters to any particular cause. If fighting breaks out in the border areas, other paramilitary groups could be drawn in, raising the spectre of full-blown regional warfare and armed groups terrorizing civilians for years to come. Sebastian Walker, Al Jazeera.